From the ashes of the Dada movement of the early 20th century, French writer André Breton published one of the earliest surrealist manifestos in 1924. Inspired by Sigmund Freud's work on psychoanalysis, Breton outlined the principles of surrealism.
So they were interested in the idea of the unconscious, which was an idea influenced very directly by Sigmund Freud. It's interesting that André Breton himself was a writer, wrote novels, wrote the Surrealist Manifesto, and there were also, from the earliest stages of surrealism, there were special, particular kind of magazines or journals devoted to surrealism. And so in some ways, I think, from what I understand, it's important to recognize that surrealism is, like you say, a movement that takes place in literature, but it's also a kind of philosophy.
Breton surrounded himself with like-minded artists and writers and would form the Bureau of Surrealist Research based in Paris. One of the Bureau's other members, French actor Antonin Artaud, would later play an essential role in the development of surrealism in cinema. Antonin Artaud was a French actor and writer closely associated with the European avant-garde movement. Artaud mainly wrote poetry and film scenarios as part of the Surrealists, while also appearing as an actor in silent films. Artaud would write many film scenarios over the course of his career. One of them would eventually make it to the big screen in 1928. The film The Seashell and the Clergyman was a collaboration between Antonin Artaud and influential French director Germain Dulac. Artaud had used the descriptions of his friend's dreams as the basis for the film scenario. The film depicts a priest who becomes infatuated with a woman while finding himself in various dreamlike hallucinatory situations. The film uses jarring and distorted imagery to simulate the state of unconsciousness. The film was a critical bomb, with an alleged riot breaking out during the film's original screening in Paris. Artaud himself was disappointed with the direction of the final film, feeling that Dulac had edited the film in a way that made it too easy and too logical for the viewer to follow, going against the original intent and vision of his written scenario. The film's reputation outside of France wasn't any better either, with the original version that was shown in the UK and the US being presented in the wrong order thanks to a mix-up with the order of the film reels, an issue that wasn't resolved until the 1980s thanks to film historian Sandy Flitterman Lewis. The confusing nature of the film also led the British Board of Film Censors to censor it. With the film's failure and having been expelled from the Surrealists by André Breton, Artaud returned to acting while continuing to write film scenarios, none of which would go on to become a finished film. The Seashell and the Clergyman has since been re-evaluated and has garnered appreciation for its groundbreaking approach to filmmaking and its influence and contribution to the Surrealist movement and cinema as a whole. Luis Buñuel was a Spanish avant-garde filmmaker who would go on to become an influential art cinema director. Salvador Dali, commonly seen as the face of surrealism, was a significant Spanish visual artist in the 20th century. The pair met in Madrid's Residencia de Estudiantes student accommodation in 1920. Buñuel was inspired by German and American films early in his career, citing Fritz Lang's Weary Death in particular as inspiring him to become a filmmaker. Dali instead remained focused on visual art, studying at the Special Painting, Sculpture and Engraving School of San Fernando in Madrid. In 1925, Buñuel would travel to Paris looking for work. While his job opportunities stalled, he would eventually enroll in director Jean Epstein's acting school. Buñuel would work with Epstein as a production assistant and an extra. Despite his early enthusiasm for film, his time with Jean Epstein would be cut short, with Epstein firing Buñuel after a dispute on set. Despite this setback, Buñuel would continue to work in French cinema. While Louis Buñuel worked towards a film career in Paris, Dali had elected to stay in Madrid. In 1923, Dali would be expelled from the San Fernando Academy of Art for a year, having criticised the teaching staff. In 1925, he would host a successful exhibition at the Dalmau Art Gallery, and a year later would showcase his works in the Madrid Herald, a contemporary Spanish magazine, as part of a feature on Catalan art. Dali's profile rose through these recent exhibitions, and he eventually planned a pilgrimage to Paris. While in Paris, Dali would meet Picasso, an artist he'd always admired, at his studio before visiting Versailles and the Louvre. It's also speculated that Dali had seen the works of fellow Catalan painter Joan Miró, who was also a known surrealist. Dali would return to Madrid to re-enroll in his studies and would reunite with Louis Buñuel, who had been visiting from Paris. In June 1926, Dali failed most of his art exams and would be permanently expelled from the academy after berating the exam board. Dali would continue to paint and host exhibits of his work, and in 1927 would paint Honey is Sweeter Than Blood, often considered his first surrealist work. Later in the year, Dali would write Artistic Film, Anti-Artistic Film, an essay criticising conventional filmmaking. Dali argued that cinema had the potential to be artistic but was being held back by its reliance on narrative and conventional storytelling. He believed the technology of film would be better served by embracing surrealist ideals to create more challenging and thought-provoking films. Dali was particularly fixated on the idea of film being used to effectively showcase metamorphosis, a concept featured heavily in Dali's painted works. This idea and Dali's attitude towards cinema would go on to influence one of the first totally surrealist films. Louis Buñuel would return to Madrid in 1929 and present an avant-garde cinema programme at the Residencia, screening René Clair's Entr'acte and the dream sequence from Jean Renoir's The Whirlpool of Fate. At the time, Buñuel would have been one of the very few Spanish artists to have had experience working in cinema, and would eventually be approached to make a film about Spanish artist Francisco Goya. While the film about Goya would never materialise, later in the year Buñuel would visit Salvador Dali, and the pair would share descriptions of each other's recent dreams. Buñuel had dreamt of the moon being sliced in half. Dali shared the dream he'd had the previous night, featuring a hand crawling with ants. Within a week, the pair had written a script for their film, titled An Andalusian Dog. The pair would aim to use the irrational and surprising without presenting any explanation. Once Buñuel had secured funding for the film, production took place over 2 weeks at Billancourt Studios in Paris. The film opens with a man, played by Buñuel, sharpening a razor before walking onto a balcony and slicing open a woman's eye in a close-up shot. After a title card appears that reads 8 years later, the rest of the film is composed of disjointed scenes presented in a non-linear form. With no narrative or plot, the film challenges viewers to find meaning within the scenes. The finished film would be presented to fellow surrealist Man Ray, who would screen it alongside his own film, The Mysteries of the Chateau of Dice. An Andalusian Dog would be screened in Paris. However, unlike Seashell, An Andalusian Dog would be an instant success. After the initial screening, the film was picked up by the Studio 28 Theatre in Paris and would be regularly screened over 8 months. The film has since been examined and is seen as an exploration of dreams in the subconscious. The film's avant-garde rejection of conventional storytelling techniques and narrative has helped cement it as a seminal piece of surrealism and helped further the careers of both Louis Buñuel and Salvador Dali. While there's no official music genre within surrealism, some contemporary examples of music could still be considered as such. In general, the surrealists were indifferent to music as an art form, with André Breton being particularly critical of music, due to his disdain for fellow French writer and artist Jean Cocteau. While Cocteau was never directly associated with surrealism, his work's exploration of dreams and the unconscious led him to being labelled as such. Cocteau would collaborate with French composer Erik Satie, with Satie going on to inspire a group of new composers who were known as Les Six. The group was comprised mainly of French composers, and they were mainly inspired by Erik Satie's 1917 ballet, Parade, which featured input from both Jean Cocteau and Pablo Picasso. Of particular interest, in the original programme notes for Parade, the word surrealism would be used as a way of describing the ballet. This use of the word is seen as the first time surrealism was used to describe a piece of art. Much like the visual surrealist artists, Lessees set out to compose more simplistic music in response to the impressionist and late romantic music of the time, while taking inspiration from composers like Satie and other styles of music like folk and jazz. Eventually, Jean Cocteau would take up the mantle as the group's leader despite his lack of musical experience, and the group would go on to compose for ballet and film throughout their respective careers.